to deploy Windows System Resource Manager. And this was a technology that they acquired back in the Windows 2000 days to do essentially accounting or control of CPU processing. So you can slice it up and say, this application will only get a maximum 20% of my resources. This other app can get 30, but it can boost to 50 if it needs it. But if something else requires it, it'll throttle it back. It allows you to do all those sorts of schemes of accounting. It's kind of funny. It's actually reminds me, it almost seems cyclical, like we're going back to the mainframe days where you used to buy a really big box and then slice your time up on that box. But you know, hey, that's the way the world works. Digging into what the request pipeline looks like, it's very much like the ASP.NET one. So if you come from the ASP.NET world, you know, you're going to look at this and go, hey, I already had that. Well, you did and you didn't. There's a couple of extra little events in there. You've got things like log request, where you can actually now affect what's writing to the log. In the past, you'd have to write a C++, a SAPI extension, and of course, you know, as .NET developers, especially for myself, I'm sitting there going, wow, it's been way too long since I've written C++. I don't want to go there. I can only hurt myself. And so they've essentially extended all the different events that are there in the IIS request pipeline for you to get in and plug in using managed code. And what's neat is you can customize this, of course, on a per site or per application or per folder basis. So it's all that control that we had in ASP.NET under the HTTP module section. You've got that for the entire server in terms of how it processes. And of course, like I said before, you can rip and replace everything here with your own modules and handlers. What they did on the install front is they took all these modules that they built and they packaged them up into cute little packages, from a deployment perspective, and they make sense. You know, you've got your security set of modules. That's all your authentication and authorization modules. You've got dynamic content. Really, that's all your ASP.NET and PHP or fast CGI for PHP, etc. Your diagnostics modules, your common components, and then the underlying process activation service. But what's neat is you can optionally not install any or all of this, really, at the end of the day. So you can say, hey, you know, I definitely don't want to allow anybody to browse directories. You know, I don't want to have even a chance that an IT guy is going to go misconfigure my web server and allow somebody to start poking around my website. And so you just not install the module. And then, or you can explicitly remove it at the site level to say that there's no chance that module will ever run within my site. If you don't like how they're doing HTTP errors, you've got a fantastic new way to do search engine optimization using the 404 page. You can replace the HTTP errors module with your own handler for any of the HTTP errors out there. I think that's pretty cool. It leaves a lot of opportunities. So they've said, hey, you know, we're shipping the base functionality, but if you can do it better, or there's a third-party vendor out there that can do it better, they no longer have to worry about writing code on top of our code. They can just toss our code to the side and plug in their own code. And so you get a lot more performance within the modules. On the configuration side, they've gone to the Xml Based Configuration, and I kind of touched on this before. The idea here is to pull a lot of the concepts that they had in the web.config from the ASP.NET world, that idea of inherited configuration. And essentially, and we'll take a look at this in a minute, the configuration file looks pretty much like the web.config does in ASP.NET. And what's really neat about that is for us ASP.NET developers is instantly we know now how to configure IIS through text files. We can use a lot of the same techniques and tools like XPath queries or search and replace to be able to manage that configuration file. And I think that's kind of a really a good nod to the ASP.NET investment and that they feel like they made the right choice. They've also done a few other things like allowing you to share that configuration for a number of servers in the web farm. So in the past, let's say you had a 4-node web farm, you'd actually have to configure IIS6 on one of the farms, run a really kind of shaky script called IIS-CNFG, and it would sync the metabase across all the different nodes. Well, it worked most of the time, and of course when it didn't work, it didn't really tell you why. And we've actually had this problem where we'd go and run it, and then one of our sites would just disappear. And of course, that's never cool. Your production application disappears. So they've thought about that in this distributed model, and they've said, hey, you can have a shared configuration store where all of your sites are configured on a DFS share or a UMC share, and all your web servers can pull from that. And that way you're configuring once, you're deploying your application once, and it's picked up on all the different nodes out there. I think that's a really neat thing there. And on top of that, they've also said, let's take some of the locking mechanisms that we had in ASP.NET. And this was like one of those overlooked features in ASP.NET, but you could say, I want to be able to define an attribute at the website level, but not at the virtual directory level. So I want to say, we're going to figure out how to handle errors, and then I'm not going to let anybody else below touch that. So if you're a shared hosting provider, for example, you may not want people to be able to add new HTTP modules randomly. So you could say at the web server level, these are the list of modules that I'll allow, and then it's locked, and then nobody else can edit it. Or conversely, you can also say, hey, as my user, you can edit these properties. And you can feel free to edit it and change whatever you want from the server default. So there's that delegation model in there as well. If you've got IIS 6 apps, though, that have done some specific stuff with the metabase, compatibility was one of those other stories where they said, we can't really just ship a brand new web server and completely break all these old applications. It's that idea, don't break the web. If you're at the IE8 talk earlier in the day, you would have kind of heard that same messages. The idea is we don't want to ship something and then abandon all that existing investment. So compatibility was a focus there. It does run through a mapping layer, so there is a little bit of overhead to what you used to have before, but a lot of your IIS 6 apps should work without a lot of change in IIS 7. And we'll talk tomorrow a little bit about how to take those old apps and move them up to IIS 7 and some of those considerations. As I mentioned a little earlier, multi-channel management, this idea of, I can really choose to manage it any which way I like. It was a key part of IIS 7. And really, it's quite exciting if you take a look at some of the tools available. In fact, let's just dig right into the tools here. So let me pull up a little bit of code here, and I'm going to try and navigate here. So what you've got in terms of the configuration file, this is the main application host configuration file. And what it does is it defines at the server level, here are the sites and application pools. Beyond that, everything else is handled in the web config. So all those settings that you used to have to tell, when you deploy my website, make sure you go into the IIS manager and go to tools and edit these properties, etc. Those are all self-contained. You can deploy those easily with your applications. But it looks pretty much like any old ASP.NET configuration in the sense that it's got all these XML elements. It runs the system.namespace, so you've got system.application host. Here's all your application pools defined, so you've got application pools, and it's just an add remove type syntax there. In fact, actually this one, you can't remove an app pool, but you can add them. And it has a bunch of subkeys. It looks like essentially the web config. But the really neat thing here is that there's nothing stopping me from going in and adding another thing like an application pool. So I'm just going to do add name equals foo, and then close that out. I'm going to save that, and that's it. I've added an application pool named foo. In the past, with the metabase, you'd have to go in and check off the checkbox that said enable direct metabase edit. You'd have to go find your way around. Good luck reading the documentation, making sure you got it right. It was just a whole hassle, and you never were quite sure if it worked. Here, all I have to do is just edit it, add my attribute, hit save, and voila, I'll have a new application. The other neat thing is that if I go into IIS Manager, I can see that it'll have picked it up automatically. Oh, and by the way, here's another neat thing. IIS Manager actually finally works from a remote scenario quite well. They've built IIS Manager on top of a web service interface, so you can use port 80, connect, or 443, I should say, SSL, and connect through to your IIS box and manage it remotely. Again, great for especially shared hosting scenarios in the past where you had to write all these custom control panel applications. Well, now you just expose IIS Manager and say, here you go. There's a lot of functionality inside IIS Manager to lock it down so that somebody doesn't need to be a server administrator to manage their own website or their own web application within the website. So let me enter my super secure password there. Cross my fingers. It's going to warn me here it's using SSL. I've just got a certificate that's self-signed, so it's just saying, hey, your certificate's self-signed, are you sure? And it's going to go ahead and do the connection. And what's neat about it, they've redesigned the interface. It's very MMC3.0-ish. It's got the task pane on the right. It's got the list of all your servers and stuff on the left. And then it exposes all the settings right away. And you'll notice one of the big things here is they've de-wizardized IIS manager. A lot less wizards, a lot more property grids. And the idea was, again, efficiency. If I want to go in and add a website, I don't want to go type in a name, next, type in another thing, next. You know, it's a lot of work. I just want a dialog where I can enter in the 5 or 6 key properties and then just get working right away. And so they've done that in IIS, but let's go ahead and take a look at our application tools here. You'll see foo is there. It just picked it up. I didn't have to reload. I didn't have to IIS reset. It just did its thing. I will warn you, when you edit the config files directly, though, it will cause some worker processes to cycle. So depending on the change you made, you may cause your entire web server to cycle automatically, especially if you're editing the application host. So just be wary of that in terms of the scope of what you're editing. But if I want to create an application pool here, I just right-click, call it foo2, and then I'd hit OK, and that's it. You know, my application pool's created. It's pretty painless. It gets me in and gets me running quite easily. But let's say I want to go and edit some of those advanced properties and then hit the advanced settings in the task pane. And I apologize, unfortunately, I can't do much to, actually I can. I can do good old zoom it. You've got all kinds of funky settings here that are now exposed in the properties grid that you, again, used to have to dig for in the old IIS manager. And I think this is really exposing a lot of really interesting stuff. There's a lot of CPU limiting bits. There's a lot of interesting new process model stuff. If you've worked with any ASP.NET applications that have used isolated storage, loading the user profiles, been usually a big pain in the butt in the past. So you've got that for yourself. You've got all kinds of other options around things like how does it handle the things like failover and some of the other bits around just the overall stuff that you used to get in IIS6, but again, they've made it more granular, like generate recycle event log entry used to be a KB article where you had to run ADS util and pass in some funky parameter, and you never really quite knew if it worked until the event showed up. So they've gone at exposing a lot of the stuff that used to be hidden. There's nothing really hidden anymore unless they didn't get time to write the full management interface, and there are a few of those out there. But again, it's a really kind of a full-featured API. When you're looking in at the various site level and the folder level, again, you're going to get the same sort of view here in terms of the different objects that you have to create. And they've done things like bring a lot of the ASP.NET stuff that was very buried in IIS6, and they exposed it up front, which makes it nice. You can also write your own, and you know, here's a view of one that we write later today in the extending session. It's nothing pretty. I'm not a WinForms guy. I'm a web guy. So my WinForms skills are different, let's just say. If you go in and want to edit a file, let's say, again, this was something that in ASP.NET, if you've used the location tag to edit settings for a file, there's always a pain. So you can just right-click on the file, switch to Features View, and now you can edit and override properties specifically on the file. In this case, directory browsing doesn't apply to files. You can't directory browse a file. So it's just telling you right at the top, hey, directory browsing has been disabled. It's not used for this particular operation. But again, you know, really kind of neat how they've exposed a full-featured UI. It's very fluid and uniform, so whether you're editing a site, a server, or a file, the experience is very much the same. But wait, there's more. It's not just IIS Manager. You've also got a lot of great nifty tools around some of the remote control pieces. And so let's go take a look at the app command and see what that takes a look like here. Sorry, let me just drag my window across. So typical command prompt here. So I'm going to go to the D drive. I'm going to go to my projects folder, and I'm going to go to my summit. And I've just got a file called rs.cmd. What this is doing is it's calling Windows Remote Shell, again, something new in Windows Server 2008, where essentially it's ps-exec if you've used that from sysinternals. It allows you to remotely spawn a process and then get the result back. So let's say I want to go ahead and run the app command remotely. So I'm just going to run my batch file to save me all kinds of typing there. And I'm just going to do C Windows System32, inetserv, and then app command.exe, because that's where it is. Do question mark to get the list of properties there. So it's going to spin up, it's going to connect. and then it's going to return me my output. So this is actually executing on my virtual machine running in the background and then returning the result. And so I can do all kinds of great things in the app command pool. And again, I apologize, it's a little tough to see, but you can hit up and change your sites, your applications, your virtual directories, random settings. If you want to extend the schema, you can go and manage that directly in here. It's really full featured here, but let's go ahead and do a app pool and take a look at that. And we can see here it's going to give me a bunch of options to be able to do stuff with the app pool. Let's go do something interesting with the app pool. Let's go ahead and add an app pool, and let's say /name foo3, and then it's going to come back here and it's going to say in a second foo3 was added. And I'm going to go verify the fact that that was added. So I'm going to do list app pool. And it's going to come back and, oh, I see foo3. foo3 has been added. It started. Great. Now let me actually go do some configuration changing here. And again, remember, I'm completely remote here. I'm on a Vista box. I have IIS installed, but if I didn't, it would operate in just the same fashion. Let's go ahead and do some settings on, or check out the configuration. So let's do a list app pool foo3 /config. And what's going to happen here is it's going to go out and get the configuration for foo3. Now, it returned nothing. Why did it return nothing? Because I actually haven't configured anything on foo3 beyond the name. That being said, there's a bunch of inherited stuff. So I'll add a colon and then an asterisk. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull in list foo3 /config. Oh, I got foo4, foo3. There we go. If I put in the right app pool, what it'll do is it will list back essentially all the inherited configuration values in XML format there. So I can actually see the net effect of all those server level properties culminating into my application pool and saying, here is the net result of all those configuration values. And again, that's actually something that didn't exist in IIS 6 unless you were sitting there through the UI, you're trying to figure out, what's that sum total of the net result of all of this stuff I've done on my particular application. Here you can just dump the configuration, say include all the various bits inherited from it. You can also set properties, and instead of list, you're going to call set. And instead of /config star, you're going to do dash, the name of the parameter, so let's say QLength, colon, and then the value. And so I'm going to set the QLength to 4,000. Now let's clear my screen here, and I will do, this time, a config. And you can see here, these are actually specific properties I've set. QLength equals 4,000. That's a value specifically set on there. So that's kind of quite neat in terms of the overall capabilities in terms of running a command line. They've also worked on extending various other aspects of the environment. They've built a PowerShell provider. Actually, good question. How many people have used Windows PowerShell? Only a handful. That's my homework for all of you. Go download Windows PowerShell and start playing with it. I did this talk last week in Toronto back home about Windows PowerShell, and if you go Google, there's a guy named David Aiken, A-I-K-E-N, and he puts out this 15-minute snippet called The DFO Show and introducing Windows PowerShell. You'll walk away from that 15 minutes seeing why Windows PowerShell is absolutely going to change all of our lives, both as developers and IT pros. It's really, really quite a powerful tool. I'll just show you very, very briefly, just I'm conscious of time here, what Windows PowerShell looks like and what I really love about it. So let's pull up my... So if I go into here, they've got the IIS PowerShell Management Console, and I'll expand the font here so hopefully you can see it. So we all know that command prompt traditionally has been used for things like navigating folders. Well, what's really neat in PowerShell is the idea of a file system is really just an abstract concept. If you want to navigate the registry using a command prompt, you can do that. Likewise, what they've done in IIS 6 is they've made the entire IIS configuration system navigatable as if it were a file system. And so you get this IIS:/ prompt where you can start doing stuff in it. So if I want to do a directory listing and just do a dir, and I can see I've got sites and app pools. If I want to change to my app pools directory, I can do that and do a dir, and I can see, hey, they're all my app pools. So I can actually start to navigate it like a command prompt. But that's the really high-level neat stuff. It gets really neat when you can start manipulating stuff. PowerShell is actually built off .NET. Everything is a .NET object, and you can start to do a lot of really cool stuff with it. I don't have a ton of time to be able to spend on this, and trust me, I could talk all day on this, but if I want to create a new app pool in PowerShell, I do new item, foo4, bang, that's it, my new app pool is created, and now I can start to inquire on to the state of my app pool. So I'll do a get item property foo4 format list and return all fields and an IIS, and it's just going to go right across the board. So I really, really highly recommend checking out PowerShell. I think for any of you who've written a console application to take in parameters and do something, you remember those quick and dirty console apps, those throwaway things? Well, look into building a commandlet. You'll never write a console application ever again when you see how easy it is. There's also one other bit, I'll just do a quick show here, is the .NET interface. So again, it's that idea of saying, we want to offer you multiple ways to manage your web server. Well, they've done that through a Microsoft.web.administration assembly, which underneath the covers does DCOM calls back to the server, but it allows you to go in and manage your server, and you can do funky things like take link. If you're using Visual Studio 2008 and .NET 3.5, you can start linking into the IIS worker processes and application pools and sites and query them and do fun stuff with them. You can also just go ahead and make calls like create application pool, where essentially all you're doing is saying add application pool, change a value, and then commit your change. It's a fairly intuitive interface, and again, exposes the same level of management interface that you're used to in all the other tools out there. And I think that's really quite powerful. On top of that, there's others. This is only the icing on the cake. There's a COM interface. There's a Windows management instrumentation provider, and then there's a management web server. So you've got many ways to manage your web server. So it's kind of like you're spoiled there, from IIS 6 where you had practically nothing. Now you've got really almost more than you can figure out what to do with. So I think that's quite an exciting part of what's coming in IIS 7. As far as extending IIS 7, as I mentioned, kind of builds off the .NET framework in a lot of ways. You still have C++, you can do a SAPI extensions all you want, but quite frankly, I've met very few really good C++ programmers. Most of them have a lot of problems with pointers and forgetting to deallocate them. So why hurt yourself? Let .NET garbage collect all of your objects for you. So you can build pure .NET modules and handlers and inject them at any point within the process, and I think that's quite powerful. And again, we'll spend the session a little later today digging into just the high level of that. You can extend the configuration schema, and what's neat about this in particular is that it can become a first-class citizen. So you saw an app command. I was just setting the queue length on the command line. Well, when you extend the configuration and apply a schema, your new schema is actually now accessible via app command, as well as WMI, as well as the COM interface, as well as really every other interface. You can actually access your schema as if it were part of IIS. So the extensibility there and the idea that it's a first-class citizen is really quite unique, and I really quite enjoy the fact that we can actually build first-class stuff. And likewise goes with the management console extensions. Really, you're just doing a user control and hosting that inside the MMC. MMC3 as a whole has become a lot more friendlier to .NET, and so that idea that my IT pros no longer have to gripe about editing XML files to change a value. Now I give them a pretty little interface, and they can go and change the values all they want. So one of these things, if I had a piece of advice, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on, but if you want to start building management console extensions, the documentation out there is kind of thin right now. If you haven't heard of a tool called Reflector, download it. It's by one of the guys that's actually part of the Expression team, Lutz Roeder. It allows you to look inside the assemblies and see how things are built. Microsoft built all their management console bits on the .NET framework, and so you can just poke at them and figure out how exactly they've built theirs. That's really kind of how I've learned how to do mine. Diagnostics extensions as well. If you've used things like the enterprise library for the logging framework, or you've used system.diagnostics, it seems like the trend now at Microsoft is to simplify. And so what they've done is they've actually built off system.diagnostics. So the whole tracing infrastructure there and the event tracing stuff in Windows has been used to do all the event tracing throughout IIS as a whole. And so they allow you to snap into that quite easily. When you're building modules, if you've built an HTTP module or a handler in the past, it's pretty much the same. You extend IHTTP module, wire up all your events in the init method, and go. There's really nothing here. It's actually built entirely off the .NET framework. They didn't try to make it anything fancy. What they did do, though, is they tried to help you out a little bit in that idea of migration and compatibility. And so they added in, as you're building these modules, you might have old IIS-6-oriented modules. And so they added this idea of preconditions. And what this is this allows IIS to say, if I'm starting up and I need ASP.NET 1.1, I'm going to fire that up for this module because this module requires ASP.NET 1.1. Likewise for 2.0. So you can start to enforce things like the framework. You can also enforce the bitness. And this is particularly important if you're interfacing with old COM objects. For those of you who are still stuck in dealing with COM objects, you know that you can't use a 32-bit COM object in a 64-bit process, not without a whole lot of finagling to try and fake it. So they've allowed you in IIS-7 to host 32-bit and 64-bit processes side by side. That's something that didn't exist in IIS-6 and actually caused us to deploy a whole lot of extra web servers because you had those old 32-bit applications that just couldn't, were never getting upgraded to 64-bit. Now you can host them side by side. And likewise, if your modules has dependencies on those, you can say as part of that module requires a 32-bit environment for it to run. So I'd take a look at the preconditions if you're doing any sort of migration. They're going to be a key component of what you're doing. As I mentioned, the configuration schema, that idea of extending and strongly typing configuration is pretty key. It's that idea that IIS can go and do some basic validation to say, hey, do I have a corrupt configuration? Is this the right value? It's really kind of important from an operational perspective because when you're sitting there editing XML, it's really easy to forget the angle bracket or the double quote. And IIS has some intelligence now about some of the custom bits that you've put in for your application to say, oh, hey, that add element? That doesn't belong here. No, don't do that. And it's actually able to provide you, useful feedback as an IT professional or even as a developer to say, ooh, that's where I messed up. Whereas in the past, it's a configuration error, sorry, and you'd be sitting there digging through things. And then exposing it through the management tools, as I talked a little bit about earlier, I think is really quite interesting. On the management console side, one of the really interesting things is they thought about this. They sat and said, how do we build a management framework that can be used remotely, can be used on the server, and can expose all the necessary bits? And so they put together an architecture like a lot of Microsoft does. And they've come up with a fancy model for doing essentially separation of concerns. So every module has a single purpose in life in terms of what it does. So you've got things like your module UI, which is the form that displays all your controls. And that hooks up to a module service proxy, which calls back to the server to say, I need to get a bunch of configuration values or set a bunch of configuration values or restart something or execute something. It's a very thin wrapper, or it's kind of like a web service proxy. You don't need to include all those server bits to get it working. Then you've got the idea of that module service on the back end, which actually receives it. And you'll see the code if you come to the session at 5 o'clock, I believe. Essentially the module service looks like the old ASMX web service. It's simply a method with an attribute on top that says, I'm a web method, go. And so really, really easy to build on top of. And then there's a few other bits under the bottom that we'll talk about in a bit. But again, really, really easy to extend out. There's a pattern. What's really lacking right now, and I can say this because I'm not Microsoft, is the documentation around this. They really haven't done a great job of documenting this, but the IIS team is writing furiously. And if you're on IIS.net, they've got a whole section, http learn.iis.net, where they're adding every week more and more articles and taking samples and building them out. And I plan to take a bunch of the stuff that we've done and document some of that stuff as well. So there's lots coming out as you go, but if you use Reflector, if you're adventurous, get on the IIS.net forums. The product group is entirely on there, so it's a great way to interface with the people in Redmond as well. Get out there and don't let the documentation stop you. The diagnostics, as I kind of mentioned, they've built on the stuff that comes with the OS, the framework, etc. So event tracing for Windows. How many people have used trace diagnostics in IIS to troubleshoot before? Anybody? A few hands? Yeah, a few hands out there. So if you've used trace diagnostics, essentially you've used the event tracing for Windows stuff. That was really just a wrapper around ETW. They've gone again and said, why would we write our own tracing framework when there's a perfectly good one in the .NET framework in Windows? And that's a fantastic decision. I applaud them for not trying to reinvent the wheel, because that happens quite a bit inside the walls of Microsoft. I saw it during my days there, and I see it now externally, that they decided to build on the stuff that they already have. And it makes it really easy for us as developers to say, I can learn one diagnostics framework and it's going to work throughout. And so they, building on top of that and taking advantage of some of the debugging features there are really, make it a whole lot easier for us as developers. So doing just a quick time check here, I've got about 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do really is I'm going to skip the extending IISnet demo and ask you, if you're really interested in it, come along to the session a little later today and we'll talk a little more about it. I was really just going to flash the code because there's just too much to go through inside the scope of 1 hour. We've got a lot that we want to share, and 1 hour just isn't enough. We want to continue this conversation for sure. On the debugging tools, who has had to debug a production application running on IIS 6? You'd see most hands up. Everybody, oh, come on, I'm not the only one who writes bad code. No. All right, so there's a couple of you out there that have had to debug production applications, and in the past, you've had to do all kinds of backward flips and crazy things to be able to figure out what the heck is going on with my application. And even as an IT guy, sometimes you just want to know what the heck is going on with my server. I see the CPU spiking, and I really have no idea on how to figure out what's causing it. Well, they've thought about that again, and they said, there's a few kind of key areas that we can make some investments in to really start to expose a lot of this information that actually existed in the past inside the core of IIS. In the past, you had to use things like event tracing for Windows to be able to get access to it. Now they've gone and exposed it. They built a whole API to give you the current runtime state of the server at any point. And this runtime status and control API will go out and give you the status of all the app pools, the worker processes, the sites, the current requests. So you can see what requests are running at this moment, how long are they taking, how much memory are they taking up, and then you can go and kill a specific request. I think that's kind of neat, especially on a high volume, situation where you've got like 1 or 2 requests that are absolutely killing the server. You can actually now see exactly who's making those calls and what requests they made in real time. That was something that you used to have to do, dumps on the IIS process before and spend hours and hours trying to figure out when to debug to be able to get a real good sense of what was going on. And I just, if I can see WinDebug less, I'm much, much happier. It's certainly quite the tool with a lot of challenges around it. The other thing they thought about is, hey, again, nobody writes perfect code. Things do crash. And sometimes you can never be there when things crash. You're not quite sure. There are times when the server throws a 500 error, and I can't reproduce it. I can't even nail down exactly what's causing it to happen. But I need to get a snapshot of what's going on in the server at that time. And so this idea of failed request tracing says, when a certain set of conditions happen, I'm going to capture everything that's going on in the server. So whether it be a 500 error was thrown, the page is taking too long to load, it returns a 404 error, or some other specific rule, what IIS has got a facility to do now is to say, just dump the entire state of the server, and we'll take a look at that output in just a second. And you'll see it's really quite verbose and quite just a nice difference between the vague errors that we had before, the times where you get those calls, oh yeah, your application died. Oh really? Thanks. Where do we begin? So the trace diagnostics I mentioned just runs through the system diagnostics framework. What I really want to do is get in and show you some of the detailed errors and some of the interesting bits that happen along that road. So let's pop open a web server or a web browser here. Drag it over here. So let's just take a look at what the detailed errors look like. And everybody remembers the IIS errors of the past. They're that white screen where it said, all this stuff about contacting Microsoft support, and then had like just a little error message along the bottom. You're like, great, thanks guys. That doesn't tell me a whole lot. Especially when you get those authentication errors, sub-authentication, blah, 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 and you're like, wow, where do I start? So now you get a much fancier error page if you choose to turn it on. This isn't on by default, so I will warn you about that. It's something that you have to turn on. You can turn it as well on to only appear when you're surfing from the local server. Oops, sorry, that's not it. That's ASP.NET. Oh, actually, that does demonstrate something. So as we're about to plug into the detailed error page, you'll notice in this case, ASP.NET kicked in and said, hey, I'm going to take care of the errors. ASP.NET can trump these pages with its own. But this is what a detailed error page looks like. And this is a simple 404 not found. But you get a lot more information. The passage just said file not bound. Sorry, called Microsoft support. Well, I don't have hours to sit on the line with PSS trying to explain to them, yes, I restarted the process. Yes, the file exists. Here I get a whole bunch of information. First off, where in that request stack did IIS fail? What module was it at? What path was I requesting? What was I trying to look for on disk? Who's logged in right now? And oh, hey, by the way, I've also dumped a bunch of failed request stuff out there that you can grab. But what's really, really interesting, and this is fantastic for IT pros, is most likely causes and things you can try. I've actually got real information that I can act on. So it's going to say here, most likely cause, the directory or file does not exist on the web server. Oh, really? Well, that's actually kind of useful because I can actually do something about it. Things you can try, create the content on the web server. Seems kind of obvious, and for a 404, it is. But when you get a sub-authentication failure and you have no idea where to begin because you only see them once every couple of years, this is actually fairly informative. Let's actually bring up something a little more complex. So I pulled up another folder here, and it's a 401.2 unauthorized. If you've ever had to deal with the 401 dot series, you know that there's a variety of different access denied errors, and geez, where do you begin here? So again, there's some fairly useful information here, and right off the top, no authentication protocols selected in IIS. That's actually the error. What I did is I just disabled all authentication altogether, and I think that's again kind of useful in the overall scheme of things here. So let me see if I can blow this up. The other thing that's really neat here is it's going to start to actually give you a variety of, again, different approaches. So I can go verify that the user is not explicitly denied access in this particular configuration section. So it's alluding to a variety of other situations that may not be as common and things that you can check. So again, they've taken all that knowledge and all that wealth of information they've had in PSS and spent some time to really think about where the problems can occur. And then they've linked off to a variety of different errors and knowledge base articles as well in the bottom. So, for somebody who's troubleshooting these sorts of problems, I've actually got real information that I can start to dig into and start doing stuff with. And I think that's really kind of cool. Let's go ahead and take a look quickly at the request monitor. And so what I'll do is I'll pull up sleep.aspx, and it'll give me about 30 seconds here to be able to show you the request monitor. So if I go into application pools, I'm going to go into default application pool, and then I'm going to go ahead and view my applications. Oh, sorry, hang on here. I'm going to go to, IIS Manager. I'm going to go to worker processes, because actually the application pool is not the actual worker process. So I'll just try and worker processes. It's going to take a second to chew through here and realize that sleep probably already finished in my, yeah. Let's go back here, F5. There's my process. And there's my particular request here. So I can see right from IIS, again, as an IT pro, I just need a quick snapshot. Oh, I see sleep.aspx is running. This is the IP it's coming from. Here's where it is in the pipeline. Here's how long it's been taking to run. It's just a really kind of quick overview of some of the particular tools there. Let's take a look at failed request tracing as well. And again, you can set this, like everything, at the server level, at the folder level, or at the file level. And again, I think that's really neat. So if you know that it's happening with one of these pages, but not the entire site, you can go ahead and capture what's going on. So let's add a quick failed request tracing rule. We're going to say for any piece of content that comes in, let's say there's an error code 200, so everything's accepted. Oops, not 2000. I'm going to go ahead and capture all kinds of information out there. And what this really allows me to do is to get in and actually start to get picky about what I get, because when you're debugging, sometimes there is such thing as too much information. And so this allows you to dig in and really understand what's going on within particular areas. So let's hit finish. It's going to go ahead and register. I'm going to go back to my web browser. I'm going to go ahead and reload sleep. And then in the background, what it's going to do is capture a whole bunch of really useful data. And let's go ahead and take a look at that while that's loading. Let me just pull up Windows Explorer here and take a quick peek here to see what these files look like. Let me just drag these windows over. So what you'll notice as well when you're in INET Pub, they've changed things a little again. So you've got www root, but they've started to throw logs in here by default. These used to be buried under Windows System 32. One of the things in the log, you got failed request logs, and you can change the location of this, by the way. So if you're worried about your C drive filling up, it's always a good idea to move logs off to a non-critical partition. But let's go ahead and take a look at one of the failed request tracing elements here and see how. So what I get here, I can't. Can I zoom it? Oh, I can. Okay, it just took a second. What I get here with my failed request tracing, yeah, that's nothing useful. It's pretty wide here. Essentially is a summary of, hey, here's what's happened. I go into the request details, and it breaks down all the different events that happen. So this is that tracing stuff in action. It takes me through all the different steps, all the modules that it hit. And again, as a module developer, I can add in my own bits and pieces to this particular event, but it also gives me time, so I can start to see where am I spending most of my time in my process. So talk about performance optimization here. First step, performance optimization right through failed request event tracing. So you get some really great tools to get some insight into what's happening. But you got a variety of different views that you can plug in here to get things like your performance view and find out, yeah, it's this particular module here that was the biggest problem, and I can ping in and view the trace, and there it is. It's ASP.NET processing that particular page that caused me the problem. I've also got a great compact view that gives me just an overview of everything that's going on. So again, a whole lot more information right out of the box. This information was just a real challenge to get in IIS 6. It was there, and it produced through some fairly arcane command line parameters to get an XML file that wouldn't give you an output nearly as pretty as this. So some really great stuff going there. I think I've only got a few minutes left here, so I'm going to look to wrap up here. So the debugging capabilities and diagnostics capabilities for production type environments is really, really powerful, and I think that's probably one of your key takeaways for this, is that if you're running a production application, you're spending any amount of time trying to figure out what is going on within the application. This is certainly one of those major releases that will help you out. A few great things to check out. Really, it's all IIS.NET. If you haven't been there, it's fantastic. There's a set of virtual labs where you don't even have to install it, and you can start playing with IIS 7. If you've got Vista installed today, you've actually got IIS 7. It's most of the stuff. They shipped some new modules with Windows Server 2008, but essentially it's IIS 7. If you are running IIS on Vista, I do recommend that you download the updated Internet Information Services Manager. It's on the IIS.NET website. It's just got, it just works a whole lot better. I don't have to be administrator of my local machine to be able to run it, so I can go back to my principle of developing as a non-admin. I've got a few other sessions here if you're interested in digging down deeper, extending IIS 7, debugging, migrating, and then finally an overall talk about what's new in VS 2008. I encourage you to come out if web development is your thing, and then I think I might have time for a question or two. Any questions about IIS 7? No? All right. Well, thank you very much, folks, and enjoy the rest of your day.